Hello again, students. Welcome back. And just going to give you a couple of basic notes about the subjects of chapters 11 and 12, which we'll be dealing with this week. And this new unit, second half of the course, we deal with some different subjects. And the first one we'll look at is our theory of the firm, basically. Our sort of modeling perspective and basic concepts about how businesses operate, how they make their decisions, and what sort of incentives that they're subject to. So we'll start off with chapter 11, and that's where you're going to see some nitty-gritty sort of analysis there. It's all about taking a look at different corporate expenses, and we split those up into a couple of different categories. So looking at the expenses, the costs of running a business. And we split these up into a couple of categories. You'll see them in chapter 11. So usually we sort of kind of take them by category. So the overall level of costs that a firm has at some level of production, okay, is the total cost. Okay, that's the overall total expense of producing a certain quantity of goods and services per hour. Right? And typically the more units you produce in an hour, the faster you're running your factory or work process, the higher your total costs are going to be, right? Using more resources, more energy, typically more labor power, right? So we have total costs there. But we'll split a business's total costs up into a few categories. The main two are fixed cost and variable cost. Fixed and variable. Your fixed costs are expenses that don't change no matter what level of production you choose. All right? So if I run my factory at a very low rate of speed, or a low rate of production, or a very high rate of production, I'm going to have the same fixed costs. So fixed cost often corresponds to like the cost of your production facility, like your mortgage payment, or if you have rent of some type on the land you're using, or maybe you have maybe you took out a loan to build your business and you have an interest payment associated with that. Those expenses don't go up or down when you change what you're doing in the factory, right? The bank you borrowed money from to build your factory doesn't care if you run it at a high speed or run it at a low speed. They just want to get their certain number of $1,000 a month, right? So those are your fixed costs. Don't change no matter what level of production you choose. They're fixed. All right? The alternative is those variable costs. And variable costs are just what they sound like, right? They're expenses that can increase as you produce more of a certain product. Right? And variable costs are usually the costs of your labor and your basic materials, like your natural resources or other inputs that you use in your production process. If I run a computer factory and I want to produce more computers, I need more plastic, more metals, more electricity, more work power to produce all this stuff. All right. So those would be your variable expenses. Okay. And usually we say your fixed costs plus your variable costs equals your total cost for any given rate of production that you might choose. And chapter 11 goes into a bit of detail about how those costs tend to behave, basically, and how firms can use them to define their profit maximizing rate of production using the marginal rule. Okay. I'll let you take that part as read. But one thing we want to mention now is something that students often tend to get hung up on a little bit in this chapter, and that's the average cost curves that you'll encounter, and also the marginal costs. Just spend a few moments on those. So one thing that I found slightly challenging when I was taking 200 level econ, and that you may want to consider as well, is how we use the term average in economic analysis in this setting of the theory of the firm. So in this context, average just refers to a per unit measurement. Okay. So for example, in chapter 11, you'll see this guy, okay, ATC. That's the average total cost. The average total cost of some level of production. All right. And you get this average total cost by just taking your total cost, okay, your overall total expense of running the factory at a certain rate of production. And you'll divide by Q, okay, for quantity. Okay, that's the number of units you're making per time period. Okay, so if let's say I make 100 units in an hour, and my total cost is $500. Okay? Well, in an hour I had total cost of $500, and I produced 100 units. So the average total cost would be $500 divided by 100 units, $5 each. Okay, that's what average means in this context. It doesn't mean like the typical thing, right? Like the average American or something like that. It means per unit, like a mathematical average. See, is what that means. So when you hear average, like average total cost, just think of the per unit cost, or even each. Because that's what average total cost tells you, right? It's the cost of making each unit of output that you produce. Okay? And you could see why that would be of some value in business, right? If you're running a business, you'd want to make sure, for example, that this number, average total cost, is less than the price, right? Otherwise, you may struggle to make a profit. Okay? So average means per unit, and we have several average measurements. So you'll see average variable cost, AVC, and that's just the variable cost, the labor and materials cost per unit. All right? You'll encounter those a couple of times. But the other one, and maybe the one that's most troublesome, is marginal cost. And marginal, it just refers to a 1 unit increase in some activity. And you may remember this from the chapter on consumer behavior and trying to model the marginal utility associated with consuming a product. Here, marginal basically looks at cost. So we have marginal cost here, right? MC. That just refers to the increase in costs of producing another unit of output. Okay. So suppose my total cost is $100 an hour, and then in order to produce one more unit, my total costs have to go up to $120 per hour. We would say the marginal cost of that extra unit is the $20, okay, the extra $20 associated with producing it. So using our delta notation, remember those triangles, this Greek letter delta stands for the change in some variable from one level to another. Okay. We've got our marginal cost as the change in total costs divided by our change in the rate of production, right? Our change in quantity, or Q. All right? And so as you move from one level of production to another, you're going to find there's a marginal cost associated with doing that. It's just the extra cost of producing another unit of output. All right? And you'll see that several times in the chapter. The key thing to realize is average values, you have one of these for each level of production, obviously. Marginal cost, that has to do with moving from one level of production to another. So it's not about some inherent thing for level of production, it's more about comparing them. Right? But as you'll discover in Chapter 11, marginal cost is very relevant for a firm finding its rate of production. Okay? So you'll see that come up. The other big subject in this week's material is Chapter 12, where we look at our first of three market structures. Right? And we've talked about what markets are, right? They're a market's just a setting for the buying and selling of goods and services. All right? What you're going to discover in this unit is that markets can come in different shapes. And one form of market is the one we usually assume in economic theory that we're dealing with, which is a competitive market structure. Right? And that market structure is based on many, many, many tiny firms competing for business. Right? What you'll see in next week's materials in chapters 13 and 14 is that there are actually three market structures. Okay? Competitive this week, that's the first one, but there's also monopoly, sort of the opposite of a competitive market structure. There you have only one firm, very large, that produces all the output in the market. Okay? And finally, in 14 you'll see that there's an intermediate market structure possibility called oligopoly. Oligopoly. And that's sort of a middle case there. That's where you've got a small number of fairly large firms producing the output and the market. Okay. We'll get to those very soon. You're starting off that journey this week with the competitive market model. And Chapter 11, you'll learn about the various expenses that firms can encounter, the different costs, and you'll use those in Chapter 11 to create your model of the competitive market firm. Okay? And of course, you have your slides to accompany you on that. And when you're ready for it, you can take a chapter test, a quiz, at the end of the week. All right? Well, hopefully this has been somewhat helpful, and see you on the discussion boards.